Hello everyone and welcome, and thank you for introducing yourself if you have done in the introduction section. And if you do need any help using Mentimeter, like I said, just shout. Victoria's popped a link onto the chat as well for you to follow. So as it's 12:30, I will start the session. Hello and welcome to our Boost Your Skills event. My name is Jenny and I'm the organizer for Boost Your Skills events. You should have all received an email from me this morning, so you have my contact details already. This time we welcome Professor Victoria Bourne for her session, which is Why Do Psychologists Need to Learn About Statistics? Before I hand over to Victoria for the exciting part, I'd just like to go through a few housekeeping points. So this is a webinar, which means that you'll not be able to turn your microphones or cameras on, but we would love to hear from you, so please do join in the chat section and also with the live polls on Mentimeter. This will be quite an interactive session and we're really looking forward to hearing from you. Victoria has broken the session down into 3 sections and we will pause for questions at the end of each section. So please do pop your questions into the chat box. Victoria and I will be keeping an eye on it, so we should be able to get through most of your questions. This event is also being live streamed to our YouTube channel and it will be saved there. So don't worry if you've missed something. I'll be sharing a link to the video after the event. I'm very pleased to welcome Professor Victoria Bourne for this event. Victoria teaches at Royal Holloway University, where her teaching is primarily around the methods and statistics used in psychological research. She has also written the excellent Starting Out in Methods and Statistics for Psychology, a hands-on guide to doing research, so it's a perfect person to talk to you about statistics. So without any further ado, I will hand over to Victoria.
Thanks ever so much, Jenny. Hello, everybody. Lovely to see you all. Jenny, thank you for inviting me to do this, and thank you to everybody for coming along and joining us in this. If you haven't done it, please do pop into the Menti and answer. There's just 2 really short, quick questions that are pretty straightforward, just to get us started. So if you wouldn't mind popping into the Menti and doing that, I've popped the link into the chat. I will just do that again. That would be really great if you could. Okay. So, so I work at Royal Holloway and I do a few different things there, but a large part of what I do is teaching statistics and research methods. And I am pretty enthusiastic about statistics and research methods within psychology. So I kind of have to admit to being slightly biased before we even get going. So the kind of idea around today is kind of, why do psychologists need to know about statistics? What's it all about? Now, one thing that's quite interesting looking at the kind of research on this is actually, if you ask students when they join their psychology degree, quite a large percentage don't even realise either that statistics is going to be part of it or how big a part of it the statistics is going to be. But particularly if you're studying in the UK, your psychology degree is almost certainly going to be accredited by the BPS, and that means that there has to be a certain amount of statistics and research in your degree. So if you want to do psychology, you're going to have to do a bit of statistics. However, the research also shows that most people think that statistics is going to be the hardest part of their degree, and there's also some slightly scary statistics around statistics anxiety. So statistics anxiety is a kind of being a bit apprehensive about statistics, and it's quite multifaceted. There are various different parts of it. Some of it is about the numbers, some of it is about the tests, some of it is about the people that teach statistics. In one of the questionnaires, there's actually an item that is something along the lines of, I don't think statistics teachers are human, which I take very personally. So it's quite multifaceted, and up to 80% have it. Now, if you think that there's 135,000 odd psychology students in the UK, if we're thinking that 80% of those have some level of anxiety around statistics, that means a lot of people are experiencing statistics anxiety. So what I'm really interested in doing is trying to break that down a little bit, try to sort of understand and think a little bit about why people aren't so keen on statistics, what it is that holds people back, and just try and sort of get statistics to be a bit more of a fun and enjoyable thing. You know, what's the point of us doing this? Why are we making all of these psychology students study statistics? So that's the kind of idea behind today. So hopefully a few of you have done the Menti, and I'm going to have a quick look and see how that is looking. Okay, so for the first one, let me just pop this on the screen over here. There we go. So I think it's a bit of a sort of love-hate thing, statistics. Some people love it, some people aren't so keen on it, and that is pretty expected. It does tend to be a bit of a love-hate thing. And then if we think, if I get the word cloud up, so the second task I asked you to do was to tell me 3 words that make you think of statistics. Okay, so programming, science, satisfying, challenge, adventure, complicated, happiness, oh, I like that one. However, there's also boredom and pain and challenge. So it is quite a kind of mixed set of emotions and feelings about statistics, which I think that kind of shows. Some people really embrace it and some people really aren't that keen on it. So why do we need to know about statistics? And I'm going to cover that in 3 different ways. First of all, I'm going to talk a little bit about how psychology, how statistics are going to help you with your career. So from the first day of your psychology degree, you're probably already starting to think about what you do after your program finishes. And so actually statistics can be quite beneficial here. So I want to talk a little bit about that. I then want to talk about how statistics helps you with your kind of broader psychology studies. And I think one of the issues with statistics is it's quite easy to compartmentalize it. So you kind of think, here's all the fun psychology stuff, and then there's the evil statistics. And I'm just going to put that in a box somewhere quite separate to the rest of my studies, because the rest of it's fun, and I don't want to contaminate it at all. So you kind of compartmentalize statistics. So I kind of want to try and bring those two a little bit closer together and think about how statistics is actually going to help you with the rest of your studies. And then I can't help myself. I am going to talk a little bit about stats and how actually it's kind of interesting and it's kind of fun. And if you can kind of try to embrace that a little bit, it can actually be real fun, not fun, it can be fun. What I'm going to do is I've split this into 3 parts. At the end of each part, I'm going to stop. If you've got any questions, I'll answer them at the end of each section. Please do pop any questions that you have in the chat as we go through, and I'll keep an eye on those. Okay, so thinking about your career. Now, one of the really nice things about doing psychology, and I think one of the reasons why it's quite popular as a subject, is it is really, really broad. You know, it goes from social psychology through to neuroscience, but also the career outcomes are so broad. There are so many different things that you can do when you finish your psychology degree. So if you look at these statistics here, it shows that around 70% of students after graduating from their undergraduate degree are either working or working in combination with further study. And if you look at the types of jobs people go into, you've got quite a lot in childcare, health education, some going into retail, some doing more admin, some doing legal, social. 40% do other, which means that there's a massive broad range of loads of different things that are happening. So what this means is there's lots of different things you can be doing when you graduate. And I'm absolutely convinced that the statistics and the research part of what you do in your degree is going to be the most useful thing for you when you graduate. You just need to know how to sell it properly when you start applying for jobs and when you start doing your interviews. So I've kind of broken this down into 12 key, what's called transferable skills. These are the things that an employer is looking for. These are the things that when you apply for a job, when you do an interview, this is what the person who's trying to recruit is going to be looking for. And you can get a lot of this out of research. So research is usually quite a collaborative thing. We don't do research completely in isolation. We're going to have a supervisor. We might be doing research with other people in our research team. We're going to be working with participants. So communication and people skills are a really important part of being a researcher. If you are working in a team, you're going to have to show those kinds of skills that you need to be working with other people. You may need to take some leadership within that, but you're also going to need to show some level of independence and autonomy. You've also got things like initiative and motivation. What is it that you're researching and why? Why do you care about this area of psychology? What is it about this that kind of gets you excited and wanting to do it? You've got to be a bit flexible and adaptable. Things don't always go according to plan. How do you deal with it when it doesn't go to plan? How do you develop that kind of emotional resilience and have the confidence to keep moving forward with your research project, even if it doesn't go to plan, even if your findings aren't significant? You've also got quite a lot of decision making and goal setting. Research has lots of different stages and steps in it that you need to work your way through. It involves lots of critical thinking and evaluation. It has lots of planning, lots of organisation. There's lots of different facets with the research project. And there's a good chance you're going to learn some IT type skills, whether that's to do with creating stimuli, programming up a study, doing the stats side of things. There's lots of different IT side of things. So there's loads of different skills that you can actually develop when you're doing research, which are going to be helpful when you're doing, when you're applying for jobs, when you're looking to, develop your career. And if you think about the whole kind of research process, you go from the background of kind of what is it you want to do? What's the research question? What's that existing literature? What's going on there? Through all of that kind of design phase, collecting your data, analyzing your data, writing it all up, there are so many different skills that you need to develop and demonstrate when you're doing research as part of your degree. So I think what's really important is to take a little bit of time to really kind of think about what are the skills that you've developed, when and how. And I think this is one of the things, this is sort of like my biggest thing that I would recommend when you're starting to think about the next steps after your degree. When you're asked, what can you do? What have you done before? There's going to be a lot of psychology graduates who can say, I can do a T-test and SPSS. What a lot of people can't say is, I used a T-test in a research project that I ran that was looking at this, and this is what I found. So really thinking, not just kind of like a list of things that you can do, but linking that into demonstrating how and why and when you use them. So really taking that time to kind of recognize what it is that you've done. Not just sort of listing the topics, but what have you actually actively, proactively done to become a researcher? What skills have you gained and how did you develop them? I think it's really important to spend some time reflecting on what you've learned. And, it's really important, we're not all perfect and wonderful at everything. Everybody has their own strengths and weaknesses. And I think going into a career, it's really important to have that kind of perspective to understand yourself and to know what is it that you're really good at and what are the things that maybe you might need a bit more support with. If you're going to be working in a team, what are the complementary skills that other people might need so that you can kind of make a complete team. So how would you develop those? And then really thinking about those links between, well, how can you use those skills in that particular career that you're going for? So I think there really are a lot of links between research skills and statistical analysis and that side of your degree that actually give you those key employability skills that allow you to get your job. And that's often why, employers like psychologists, because we have these kind of well-rounded research skills. So that's kind of why I think statistics is so important for your career. I've put a couple of links here. And the first one is just the link to the BPS careers page, which has loads of different advice on loads of different careers. But there's also the Student Employability Guide, which is an HEA document, or Advanced HE, how it's called, document. And this employability guide is really helpful. And I think one of the things that's most useful in it is it's got some excellent CV writing guides and it really kind of goes through an example of bad one and a good one and how to adapt it. There's lots and lots of hints and tips in there. So that is why I think statistics and research is important for careers. Does anyone have any questions at that point? If I move on to the next bit. Hello, everybody. So I'm just looking for the chat, seeing everybody saying hello. Okay, so the next thing is kind of trying to map what you do with statistics and research onto the rest of your degree. And like I said, it is quite easy, particularly if you're not that keen on statistics, to try and compartmentalize it. You kind of put it in its own little box and you deal with it very separately to the rest of psychology. But I think that can actually, in the short term, seem a good strategy, but in the long term, it can actually be a bit of a disadvantage. And I really think you can use what you do in research and with statistics to enhance your entire degree. And I think this is in two different ways. First of all, thinking about understanding psychology more broadly, but also thinking slightly more pragmatically, how can that be of benefit to you when you're completing your assessments, when you're doing your coursework, when you're writing your essays, when you're doing your exams, even the ones that aren't for research modules. How can research skills help you with those other assessments? So thinking about psychology generally, psychology is research. And I think this is one of the reasons why I love being a psychologist and working in a psychology department. It really is one of the disciplines where it feels so incredibly current, and it feels like what we're doing with research at the moment is what's happening. It's where we are. We're actually able to create psychological knowledge now. Even as an undergraduate student, you can do a research study that is on a completely novel research question and find out something new that nobody else knows. So all of psychology really is about research. In this way, I think it's really the more we understand research, the more we can understand psychology, because everything we know about psychology comes out of research studies. So to understand what's going on with psychology, we are going to be benefited by understanding research. So if you look at the core areas of the BPS curriculum, if you look at cognition, how do we learn things? How do we remember things? How do we read? How do we think? How do we speak? All of these cognitive skills, we know how they work because somebody developed a theory, but then they went out and they did some experiments, they did some research, they ran some stats. So everything that we're learning about cognition, we only know because somebody did a research study. Same thing with developmental psychology, looking from prenatal development right the way through to cognitive aging and dementia studies, right the way across the lifespan. Everything we understand about the way that people change across the lifespan comes out of research studies looking at aging in different ways, whether it's experimental or correlational, whether it's longitudinal studies or cross-sectional, all these different things, they're methodological concepts. Thinking about individual differences, I'll come back to this a little bit later on, but variability is the most exciting thing there is in statistics. Thinking about individual differences, thinking about intelligence, thinking about personality. Why do some people have more extroverted personalities? Why do some people have more conscientious personalities? Where are those differences coming from? Thinking about neuropsychology and neuroscience, all of the research around different brain areas, around plasticity and recovery from injury, all of these things, we only know about them because of research studies. Social psychology, thinking about how we function in large groups at a societal level and how we interact with each other and interpret other people. Again, we only know about these things because of research. Thinking about mental health and well-being, there's so much research there looking at understanding different mental health conditions, but also looking at treatments as well. Everything we know about psychology comes from research studies. So if we can kind of embrace that understanding of research methods and statistics, that's going to help us to understand the psychology far better and to really get that deeper level understanding, thinking about the actual studies that led to the findings rather than just kind of working with the findings themselves. And to be slightly more pragmatic about things, with your assessments, you can actually use your research skills and your statistical understanding in your assessments to help get better marks. So here I've just put the marking criteria where I work. This is just for the first class marks. And if you look through that, lots of the things that we're looking for in a first class essay are actually things that you're learning and you're developing and that you're demonstrating through research skills and statistics and lab reports. So things like being accurate, adhering to a particular style, explicitly addressing a question, looking at learning outcomes, showing evidence of wider reading, having that initiative to go out there and find stuff, understanding issues, concepts, methods, using originality of thought, using evidence in that way, constructing arguments clearly, evidence of analytical skill and problem solving. These are all research skills. So sometimes I kind of think if you approach your coursework almost like a research question, you can actually dig into some of those ideas, some of those concepts, some of those approaches, and that can help you with your studies more broadly. So I think sort of research methods and statistics really can put you at a nice advantage when it comes down to studying psychology more generally. So that's kind of the psychology studies side of things. Okay, so for the final bit, I want to actually get on to convincing you why statistics is actually really exciting and really interesting and really relevant. Why do we want to do it? So why would we bother at all with statistics? Why do I get so interested and excited? I want to take a really simple research example. Does IQ differ according to hair color? And here I'm just going to do a really simple experiment. I am going to take a group of people with brown hair, a group of brunettes, and a group of people with blonde hair, the blondes, and I'm going to get each one to complete an IQ test to see how intelligent they are. So for each participant, we're going to get that IQ score. And the research question is, does IQ differ according to hair color? If you would like to put your predictions into the chat, you are very welcome to do so. It'd be interesting to see what people think we would actually find. Do not be influenced by the fact that I am blonde. So we would start, you think they're going to be the same? Similar results? Depends on sample size. Oh, interesting. Lots of people saying no differences. Okay, so the question now is, okay, well, that's what we think might be happening. But what kind of evidence, what do we need statistically to be able to answer that question? So what are the numbers we need to really work at this? Well, there's some really interesting points coming through. I'm going to come back to some of those in a minute, actually. The first thing is, on average, how intelligent are the blondes and the brunettes? So I can calculate the average. I can use my descriptive statistics. And I know that the brunettes have a mean of 115 and the blondes have an average IQ of 121. So we can quantify, we can summarize the average intelligence of our two groups. But the question then is, do they differ from each other? Is there a significant difference between blondes and brunettes in terms of their IQ scores? And this is where, we're often, it feels a bit like we're desperately searching for the significant findings. Just because there's a difference, is it actually going to be significant? So how is this going to work out in terms of understanding our data and our findings? Imagine that we have two separate labs with two separate sets of participants. And I've asked them both to run the same study, looking at the blondes and the brunettes. to see how intelligent they are. And these are the findings from the 2 studies. So we have lab study 1, that's the first study, and then lab study 2 with the second study. Same kind of design. We have a group of brunettes, we have a group of blondes, and then we're going to measure their IQ. Now, if you look at these 2 studies, who would be kind of happy saying that there's a replication going on here, that you kind of, the 2 different labs found kind of the same thing? Would you be happy calling this a successful replication? I mean, they look kind of similar. Yeah, I mean, the IQs look pretty much the same. How confident would you really be? Remember, at the moment, all we're seeing is the averages, the means. We're not actually seeing the real data. Who's being tested? That's a really interesting question. I will come back to that one in a minute. If we look at the raw data, I'm a big fan of looking at raw data. You don't want to just see the summary, you want to dig in there, get your hands dirty and see the raw data. This is the raw data from the first one. Exactly, we need to see the numbers. So these are the data from the first one. So these are all of the brunettes. They all have a really similar IQ. They're kind of very, very similar scores. The blondes, very, very similar scores. Now, what's really nice about the data collected in lab group 1 is there's a very clear difference between the IQ scores of the brunettes and the IQ scores of the blondes. So if you look at the raw data, not only does that average look like there's a bit of a difference there, but you can clearly see the clustering of the data for those 2 groups. If you were just to look, you would very easily kind of assume that these participants here somehow belong to a different kind of group than these ones over here. This is a beautiful data set. This is what you would want your data to look like when you're doing your own study. In the second one, remember the means were exactly the same. But when you look at the raw data, it's clear there is something very, very, very different going on in lab study 2. Now here, there's a far, far, far bigger spread of data. So there's not so much consistency within each of my groups. I've got some brunettes who have those higher scores, some brunettes who have lower scores, and you've got a similar kind of spread with the blondes as well. Now, what's really interesting here is if you look at this kind of middle set, these kind of 5 participants out of a sample of 10, so a really small sample, but half of them, if you were just to take a guess, you would not be able to guess whether they were blonde or brunette based on their IQ score. This is messy data. This is not how you want your data to be looking if this is your data. There's a big spread going on there. There's a big overlap between my 2 groups. So there's clearly some other stuff going on in lab study 2. In lab study 1, I would be a bit more confident here saying there's a difference in IQ depending on hair color. In lab study 2, I would not be anywhere near as confident. There would definitely be more stuff going on. So going back to the chat, there are, characteristics are going to differ. Is it difference in how people treat blondes? There's other different things. Definitely a much larger study is required. This is just for simplicity's sake, having this number of participants. But there's clearly other stuff going on. So, as a researcher, what I want to be thinking about is, okay, there's a lot of variability in lab study 2. Why? What's going on in lab study 2? Why in lab study 1 is that variability really small and neat? And why in lab study 2 is there a far larger amount of variability? And I think this is one of the really important things with statistics is, statistics doesn't exist in isolation. Statistics is really there to tell us about the methodology. So what is it that's different about the methodology between these 2 that would lead to very, very different conclusions, even though the means are the same? So is there something to do with the way that they've sampled their participants? How did they recruit them and select them? Is there some difference in the participant characteristics between the 2? Is it to do with the way that the experimenters treated their participants, the instructions that were given, what is it methodologically that led to this extra variability in the data set? So I think it's really important to kind of feel able to sort of dig into the raw data and actually look at this, because if you just looked at the means, you wouldn't have anywhere near as interesting a conclusion. So how are we going to explain this variability in the data set? And explaining and understanding and thinking about variability, I think, is at the core of everything that we do with statistics. It's all about understanding variability, because whenever we measure any kind of variable, there's always going to be variability. I can't think of a single variable where every single participant would get exactly the same number. There's always going to be variability in the data. There's always going to be higher scores, there's going to be lower scores. The real question is, where does that variability come from? How do we explain that variability? Now, in lab study 1, most of the variability in the data we've collected can actually be explained by the hair color. So the variability in scores, these people here seem to have a higher IQ and they're blonde. These people down here seem to have a slightly lower IQ and they're brunette. So the best explanation here for the variability in the data set is hair color. That's going to be the best explanation for why we're seeing that variability. Whereas over here, the variability is far more difficult to explain. It's far more random. There is clearly other stuff going on that would explain that variability. So what is it to do with? Is it to do with the particular participants? Is it to do with the way we recruited them, the instructions, the IQ test used? Is it to do with the inclusion or exclusion criteria for the participants? What is it that's different here? There is something else that explains the variability, but we don't know what that is. It's random variability. There's far more random variability in our data set. So the means are identical in these two studies, okay? The IQ score for the blondes and the IQ score for the brunettes is exactly the same in those two studies. Don't forget that. But variability is so different, and that gives you a completely different interpretation of what's going on. So in lab study 1, the best explanation of the variability is the difference between the two groups. Whereas in lab study 2, the best explanation for the variability is something random and I don't know what it is. And this is what statistics is all about. This is what we're doing with statistics. The key outcome that we're looking for is understanding the variability in our data, understanding what is going on so that we can best understand how people think, feel, and behave. So just kind of mapping this on to statistics slightly more. Statistics is all about cake. Everything that we do in statistics can kind of be looked at as if it's a cake. Statistics cake. Everything that we're doing is looking at variability in data, trying to understand variability in data, whether we're doing an experiment or something correlational, it's all about understanding the variability. So if you imagine that all of the variance in our data set is a cake, what we're trying to do with statistics is understand where the variance comes from. Does it come from the variable that I'm interested in? The difference? So hair color? Is it good variance? Is it the variable that I'm really interested in? Or is it that leftover random junky variability that I don't know how to explain it because I didn't measure that variable, but there's loads of it there. And whenever you're looking at a data set, you can divide it into the good variability, the difference variability, the experimental, the model variance, and you can separate it out from the random junky leftover residual variance. And if you look at how that would work for these two studies, again, remember, the mean is exactly the same in these two studies. In this first study over here, most of the variability is this difference variance. You can see the difference between the two groups really clearly. So when you divide up the cake into two slices, most of the cake is going to be that difference variability, the good stuff that we're really interested in. Whereas the other study that we have, there's far, far, far more random variability going on. So again, remember, the means are exactly the same, but when we look at explaining the variability, there's not quite so much of the difference variance here. In this example, the variability is best explained by that random residual leftover junk. And this maps on directly to calculating the significance of something. So in the first example, we're likely to get a significant result because the variability is best explained by the difference between the groups. Now, again, remember, the mean is exactly the same in these two examples. However, in the second example, you're far less likely to get a significant result, far more likely to have no significant difference. And it's because the data are better explained by that random variance and by that difference between the two groups. And essentially, that's what statistics is trying to do. It doesn't matter whether you're looking at differences or correlations. All of statistics is simply trying to understand variability in data, trying to understand why do some people have a high score and some people have a lower score. And how do we explain that? How do we understand that variability in a data set? And I find that when I sort of think about statistics in that kind of variability way and linking it back into methodology and what the findings really mean, statistics becomes a bit more tangible, a bit more necessary, realistic, and a bit more usable, perhaps. So that's kind of how I think that statistics, actually, it's not about the equations. Statistics is about understanding how people think, feel, and behave. It's understanding why everybody is a bit different and why we all do things differently, and understanding and explaining that and thinking about those sources of variability in our behavior is really, really important. So hopefully that gives you a little bit of a kind of whistle-stop tour as to why psychologists need to learn about statistics. It's going to help you get a job and do well in your career. It's going to help you understand psychology more generally, but also stats is fun. Looking at data is fun. It's how we understand people. And by doing the statistics, you know, when you do a research study and you do the statistics, I'm always struck at that moment when you get your results through and you think, what does this mean? What's actually going on? In that moment, you're the only person on the planet who understands and knows this about psychology. Because until you share your results with other people, no one else knows what you found. And you are the first person to know this about psychology, to understand what this finding is and what it means. And that moment when you get your results, I think is the most exciting bit of psychology, because that's when you're creating psychology yourself. So hopefully I have sold you all on statistics is actually the best bit of the whole psychology degree, most exciting bit. So with all of that said and done, I'm just wondering if anybody has any questions. Thank you, Martina. I'm happy to answer questions on anything, by the way, well, within reason. I think sometimes it is seen as dull, and I think that's such a shame. I think statistics is just how we get to understand everything. And I think it's fun. We want to do psychology because it's fun. We want to do psychology because it's interesting. We want to do psychology because it tells us something really meaningful about people. And if we want to get those answers, we need to understand the data we collect. So I think it's just kind of thinking about statistics a bit as a tool that's part of being a psychologist. What would be the first thing you would say to someone who's scared of statistics because they're not confident with maths? I would say there's a very big difference between maths and statistics. And this is something that I hear quite a lot. Oh, I'm not a maths person. I'm not good with that. My brain doesn't work in that way. I can't do statistics. I'm no good at maths. And maths and statistics are very, very different things. And I'm incredibly confident that you don't need to be wonderful with maths to be good at statistics. And I can say that from personal experience because when I started doing my A-levels, I was doing maths and I was horrific at it. It went horribly wrong. I was not good at maths and I ended up dropping out of maths. Well, no, I ended up dropping out my A-levels and I just scrapped it and started again because the maths just went so horribly wrong. I was so bad at it. I started again. And when I started again, one of the subjects I picked up was psychology. So I only really got into psychology because I was so horrific at maths that I dropped out of maths A-level. And through my psychology A-level, I didn't engage with stats as much as I probably should have done. But then when I got to do my psychology degree, I had a really amazing, interesting, approachable stats teacher. And that was the point at which I started to get into stats and enjoy it. So you don't have to be good at maths to do statistics. I think there is some level of numeracy involved in statistics, but it's not maths. So I think try to sort of separate them out. You don't have to be amazing at maths to be good at statistics because I'm no good at maths and I spend my life doing stats now. So I think it's kind of trying to put the maths to one side a little bit and try to sort of remember what is it that we're doing with statistics. Statistics is just a tool that we need to use to help us understand psychology. So yes, that's what I would say. Don't worry about it because I'm no good at maths either. We can just work on the statistics and understanding those links between statistics and psychology and using it as a tool. I think struggle with SPSS to interpret the data that's challenging. Yes, I think SPSS is 50% wonderful and 50% horrific. It does a lot of statistics, really complicated, big statistics really quickly. But it can be slightly more challenging to use and interpret. And one of the things that I think can be really helpful with SPSS, I don't know how you've been taught it. I know lots of places teach statistics in very different ways. But one of the things that I'm really keen on is not getting into SPSS too early. So when I teach statistics, for the whole first year, there's no SPSS. We do it by hand with a really old school, basic, the most boring calculator you will ever have seen. And we literally sit there with calculators calculating basic statistics. And I think there is a real value to doing those calculations. And I think what's really important is to kind of separate out learning the basics of statistics from button clicking in SPSS and interpreting the output. So I think it's really important to get that kind of strong foundational statistical knowledge before learning SPSS. Because if you try and do them both together, you're learning statistics and you're learning SPSS at the same time. And if you struggle with either of those, the other one falls down too. So I think it's good to do things one at a time. It's good to do statistics, and then you're simply learning how to use SPSS as a tool quicker than clicking buttons on a calculator. So I think SPSS can be really challenging. Maybe to try and deal with that, try to separate out the stats from the SPSS. So try and get your head around what statistically you're trying to do before you then get into the SPSS side of things. I think it's very difficult to do both of them at the same time. All the best ones fail AS Maths. I'm glad you agree. I mean, definitely interpreting and understanding statistics is such a different skill to maths, such a different skill. And I think that's one of the issues, is that they're just sort of artificially put together so much, and they're such different skills. I think, you know, statistics is so much more applied, so much more interesting. It's just a tool that we're using to answer a question. So I'm just going to check through the chat in case I've missed. Statistics are vital to progress society. I completely agree. We need data, we need evidence, whatever it is we're looking at. And I think that's one of the things where I think because there's this sort of anxiety and this kind of, I'm no good at maths, so I'm not going to look at statistics. People sometimes don't engage with statistics. And I think when you see statistics presented in the media and on social media and in the news, and numbers are being thrown at us quite often, and the ability to really think about what do they mean, I think is actually quite a nuanced, difficult skill sometimes. And as a psychology student, you get to think about those things and ask those questions. And sometimes I do think it would be amazing to be able to do a kind of public science statistics thing and try to sort of help people to really get a grip of what statistics really mean. What do these numbers really mean? How do you think about it and break it down and get that understanding so that you can kind of come to conclusions and think about things on a whole range of topics. I mean, statistics isn't just for psychology. Just looking at the comment from Chloe. So when I was doing my foundation degree, I made us aware, but didn't introduce it until first year. So able to understand everything before learning how to use SPSS, it made life so much easier. It definitely is. I think having the two things together is so difficult. So I really do. I mean, when I teach it, I don't introduce SPSS until second year. The whole of the first year is based just on the calculator. So it's really interesting that you have had a similar experience and you've sort of seen the advantages of that as well. I think I'm probably doing it a more extreme way. I think quite a lot of places will teach you the stats and then teach you the SPSS a week later, a term later. But I think the sort of key thing is, if you are learning with SPSS and you're finding it difficult, try to separate out the SPSS, put the SPSS to one side for a bit and just go back to basics and really think about the data, look at those plots with the raw data points, think about what are the statistics trying to do, get to grips with the basic statistics first, and then when you're feeling a bit more comfortable with what it is you're looking for, then you can use SPSS as a shortcut to do all of the complicated calculations for you, but without understanding the purpose behind what we're asking, SPSS is not quite so interesting. So for my undergraduate, which was only 8 years ago, I did interpret data by hand, but forgot all of it. It's so challenging. My current teaching is more of a rush of SPSS hands-on. I think what's quite interesting though is, doing things by hand, it's not just about learning the equations and remembering the equations later on. I think there's a real value behind kind of experiencing doing the calculations. There's actually a value behind kind of going through each data point and going, okay, the mean minus this, the mean minus this. It really kind of embodies the statistics we're looking at. So even if you don't remember what the equation is, I think going through the process of doing those calculations makes it far more obvious what we're doing. So, if you're doing a t-test and you're calculating it, that final stage of the equation, it's just a division sum. And it's just how much experimental variance, how much difference variance is there, divided by how much random variance is there. And so there for your t-statistics, is just telling you what's that ratio in your cake. So I think there's a value to going through it in terms of conceptually understanding what statistics is about. So I think doing things by hand can be helpful in terms of the process itself and conceptually understanding things. More or Less is a great BBC Radio 4 programme. I love it. It really kind of breaks down stats in quite a tangible way. I think it's a really good one that I recommend before people start their degree, to kind of start getting into thinking about statistics and the way we present data and the way we think about data. I think that's a really, really, really great program to get started. Yeah, I think it's really difficult to separate stats from SPSS. I mean, SPSS, it's really just a fancy calculator. And I think lots of people approach SPSS as if it's the statistical knowledge. SPSS is not the statistical knowledge. SPSS is a fancy calculator. We're the brains behind the operation. We're the ones who understand what the variables are, what we're looking for, how we're analysing the data to try and understand it. So I think it is really important, but really difficult to separate those two things out. That's why I think it's better to do one and then the other, rather than trying to do both of them at the same time. I love stats, could you tell? Okay, I think that's all of the questions come through.
It looks like it, yeah. So
if something crops up later on that you think about, you think, well, that would have been interesting to ask or chat about, you know, do feel free to drop me a message afterwards. I'm happy for you to tweet to me or email me or whatever it is.
Okay, last chance for anyone to ask a question. Okay, I will share Victoria's Twitter page with you so that you have those contact details and all of the details in the chat and the slides, so you have all of the information. So that will all be coming to you in an email fairly soon, and along with the link to the video as well. So thank you very much everyone for coming and joining in so well as well and asking good questions. We do have a survey when you log out of the event. There will be a survey that pops up. If you do have time to complete it, then it really helps us improve these events for you. We have a series of events, so if you are interested in hearing more, there will be a link in the email I send out with some information on how to join our mailing list so that you can hear about more events coming up. And thank you very much, and thank you Victoria for a really good session. And I don't really sort of have to use statistics too much, but I feel like they're a bit nicer now.
They're great fun. Anyway, thank you so much for inviting me, and thank you everybody for coming along and joining in with your questions. It's great to virtually meet you all.